welcome to Old Spook Lane, where we're covering creepy topics this month on Creepy Chat. I am Patricia, and I'm here with Aaron Meta from the Aaron Meta Show.
Yes, Arun Meta, and I'm not just putting a scary voice on for Old Spook Lane. This is actually how I talk right now because I was at a Preston North End game yesterday as of the time of this podcast. So
Yes. Yeah,
yeah,
so he's going to be acting a little bit more macabre, although very unintentionally.
yeah,
Not to spook you, but because he's tired.
I'm the Igor to the mad scientist, pretty much.
Or in this case, you're actually the little maggot who's in the eye of one of our protagonists for our discussion of our movie today.
Way to cut me down there, Patricia.
I mean, I
Okay.
don't know. I mean, I guess in a sense, you have like a little companion who's with the character who's just trying to make sure that he brings out the best in her. So I guess it kind of fits in a way.
Yeah. So, anyway, should we tell everybody what we're going to talk about today?
Yes, let's do so. So, yeah, we're going to be doing our final installment of Tim Burton Month, and we're going to be skipping about a few years, about all the way to 2005. Now, I know we could have been covering something like Sleepy Hollow, or maybe we could have covered Sweeney Todd, but this time around, we decided that we're going to be covering his second stop motion animated film, or third, if you want to count James the Giant Peach, which he did executive produce. We're talking about Corpse Bride.
Yeah, and another movie people thought we could cover is Big Fish, but I think we've already covered that for In Search of the Crystal Skull,
We
if I
never did.
recall. Oh, didn't we?
No,
Oh,
we
okay.
never talked about Big Fish. Although we really need to talk about Big Fish and Crystal Skull. I would absolutely love to. But no, the reason why you're thinking of that is because funny enough, we actually have an entire separate list of Tim Burton movies for Crystal Skull that are none of the movies that we've covered for Old Spook Lane.
Yeah,
So
but I do recall we have both watched it together.
we
So,
have
yeah.
actually. Yeah, I remember it was like several years ago. You came over for Thanksgiving, and I introduced to you for the very first time Big Fish because it's one of my favorite Tim Burton movies. And it might be my favorite Tim Burton movie of the 2000s. So I introduced it to you, and I even told you that, hey, did you know that this movie was actually shot in Alabama? And I actually know where some of the locations are. They're actually about like maybe 4 or 5 hours from where I live. And so we watched this movie together, and you said it was a really, really solid film.
Yeah, it definitely was. And for all of you wondering why we're making conversation about this and not about Corpse Bride, let's be honest about this. People are going to be very surprised about my reaction to this movie, and because the reason why I can see why people like this movie is because one, it's made by Tim Burton because it's directed by him along with Mike Johnson, so those are all positives there. The music is also by Danny Elfman, same Danny Elfman who also did Nightmare Before Christmas. And then the cast, I think, is stellar. It's got Johnny Depp, it's got Helena Bonham Carter, it's got Emily Watson, Tracy Ullman, from the Tracy Ullman Show, Joanna Lumley, Albert Finney, Robert E. Grant, and also Christopher Lee also makes an appearance on this. So, I mean, a lot of people will be saying, well, why is it that this movie doesn't gel with you, Aaron? Well, let's talk about it, shall we?
Yes. So Corpse Bride is actually based off of an old Jewish folktale known as The Finger, where a rabbi was recently celebrating his upcoming marriage with his friends. They wander into the woods and they decide for a joke they're going to put a ring on a corpse. The corpse comes to life and she thinks that they are officially getting married. And so he is stuck in a predicament where he is now married to this corpse bride. He goes over and he talks over to the other rabbis in the synagogue, and then they come to the conclusion that the marriage is not valid because he's still alive and she's dead. She gets really, really heartbroken by this, and she ends up as a pile of bones. The Jewish folk tale was adapted in a short story written in 1987 by Howard Schwartz called Littlest Caves Jewish Tales of the Supernatural. And that was the same book that Tim Burton was introduced of Corpse Bride thanks to executive producer Joe Raft back when he was working in Disney. And so for over 10 years, Tim Burton wanted to do this adaptation on Corpse Bride, but he was really, really busy with a lot of his other projects. At the time of the 2000s, this is where Tim Burton was probably at his most mainstream, where he was still getting some bit of credit, but not as much credit as he used to back in the 90s, where essentially like everything he touched essentially turned to gold. And he was like in so much power and money where he can be able to create such really unique things that he just went all out with some weird, weird stuff. Mars Attacks, which is basically like a 1950s B sci-fi film. And do you remember this, Aaron, that he almost was going to be doing that Superman movie with Nicolas Cage?
Yeah, imagine if that came to light. That would have been so weird.
That would
Like,
have been really
Tim
weird.
Burton's Superman with Nicolas Cage as Superman. Like, the mind wanders. It really
Yes.
does.
Yeah. If you're interested in knowing more about this weird anomaly about Tim Burton almost doing a Superman movie with Nicolas Cage, there's this really great documentary that you need to check out where
Isn't
it
there
go
test footage out there of it as well?
Yes, there is
Yeah.
test footage of it that only lasted for like maybe a few minutes, and you get to see pictures of John of Nicolas Cage as Superman, and he looks absolutely ridiculous. Now, for those who are wondering why does he look like that, well, the reason why was because they were taking the '90s Superman from the comic books where he had the mullet.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, like, if Tim Burton probably did like Injustice, it's probably like, that version of Superman, like, and he made him into kind of like, like a villain, if you will, like this dictator. I mean, I could always see Tim Burton kind of doing that, but Tim Burton taking like the 90s Superman with the mullet and, making Nicolas Cage, like, kind of do these types of things, it's so strange.
It
It's
is
amazing
very
how he,
weird.
it's amazing how he decided to come up with that. But anyway, I'm sure there's a whole documentary about it that we need to
There is
watch,
an
I'm sure.
entire
But
documentary of it, so go check it out.
yeah,
Anyway,
yeah.
so yeah, the 2000s was a very interesting decade for Tim Burton, where some of his movies were definitely very mixed. I mean, we talked about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory during the Roald Dahl retrospective, where a lot of people were having mixed reactions towards it, especially when they compared it to the 1971 film with Gene Wilder. And then he did a remake of Planet of the Apes, that weird anomaly that came out about a decade before the reboot of the Planet of the Apes movies that we would have today with Andy Serkis as Caesar. Then of course there's Big Fish, which I said, and I will say to this, unapologetically, Big Fish, even though that is, like it wasn't like as successful compared to his other films, it is, in my opinion, the best film that he ever directed in the 2000s. And then there's Sweeney Todd, and Sweeney Todd was a pretty good movie. It's based off of a musical, and yeah, I think that more people seem to lean towards that when they think of like the essence of what Tim Burton is. But yeah, let's talk about the movie that came out before Sweeney Todd, and that would be Corpse Bride. Yeah, the plot synopsis goes as this: is that is a young man who is engaged to be married over to the daughter of a lord and lady who have practically no money left, and they're hoping that the son of a fishmonger can be able to get them out of debt. But the problem is that they do not like him. Surprise, surprise. And so he gets really, really nervous about saying his wedding vows. And then he runs away into the woods trying to practice his wedding vows. And he puts the ring on what he thinks is a branch, but it turns out to be the finger of a corpse known as Emily. And she is dressed up in a wedding dress because originally she was supposed to get married to someone, but he betrayed her, killed her off, and then she was left dead, being completely heartbroken that she was never able to get married to the one that she loved. And she thought that the man who put the ring on her was the one that was going to finally get her the opportunity to get married. He wants out of this because this was a simple misunderstanding. And the whole point of it is that he's trying to get himself out so that he can be able to marry the woman that he was engaged to. And then along the way, the family of the daughter is going to be engaged over to this lord because, he, in reality, he wants her money and her power when they don't really have it. And she's trying to find where the young man is right before the sun rises. So, yeah, that's essentially what the plot is. And yeah, here's the thing. This is my very first time ever watching Corpse Bride. I had never seen this movie before doing this podcast. I saw
I've seen it 3 times, and every single time I watch it, I always thought, oh, maybe one day it will grow on me. But but anyway, I'll let you say what your first experience was with it.
to be
So.
quite honest, I was pretty underwhelmed with it.
You know what? I gave this movie 3 opportunities to kind of like say because one I watched it with my family, and then another time I just found it happening on TV. And nothing else happened to be on at the time, so I just watched it to see if it would, I could feel like that. It is the thing. It's really hard for Corpse Bride because there's one thing that exists, unfortunately, and that's the Nightmare Before Christmas. And there's a lot of people that I knew around in my social circles who used to say, "Oh, Corpse Bride, yeah, it sort of kind of reminds me of Nightmare Before Christmas," and that was something I heard so many times every time. And every time people brought that up, they realized how, they missed, Nightmare Before Christmas and how much they didn't really like Corpse Bride all that much. And
Yeah.
I don't know, it's because maybe it's because, I mean, given the fact that this was directly, well, not directly, but it was co-directed by Tim Burton and Henry Selick was not in, as far as I'm aware, was not involved.
He was not
I mean,
involved because, like we
yeah,
mentioned before in the Nightmare Before Christmas podcast, he was definitely a man who was quality over quantity. So, this was after he finished with Monkey Bone, which that's a nightmare fuel in itself. And then around that time, he wasn't really doing too much. I mean, this was like a few years before he was called in to do Coraline. And remember, he almost did Fantastic Mr. Fox, but then he was working on Coraline with Laika. Which, speaking of which, this is Laika's very first stop motion animated film.
yeah. So the question I wanted to ask you, Patricia, is that do you think the fact that Henry Selick is not at the helm and Tim Burton is like, at front and center of this and not to kind of like, be on the side like he was with Nightmare Before Christmas, do you think that's the problem with this movie?
No, it's not
Yeah.
because he wasn't really involved with too much of the directing. It was Mike Johnson who was at the helm of this for the most part.
So I guess we're sort of kind of pinning more of the problems with this movie more on Mike Johnson than we are on Tim Burton.
I think that the story itself is probably the weakest part of this entire thing. It feels more like a draft than, say, a final product. And the problem is that it's too short. It is literally 1 hour and 15 minutes long. It
Well,
should
I
have.
mean, to be fair, most of these movies are quite short because, I mean, they're stop motion animation, and two, I mean, obviously they are garnered towards, a family, environment, which is kind of weird when you really think about it. This movie is supposed to be, for you take the family and the kids to go basically see this movie. And keep this in mind, like, I mean, don't get me wrong, like, it did come out at the right time. It came out around about the September, October time, so it was in time for Halloween.
Yeah, and,
But
and
I
then
mean,
then there's another problem is that this movie came out a month before Curse of the Were-Rabbit.
yeah, exactly. And so that blew it out of the water. So yeah, I tell you what, there was far, far, far more people in the theater for Curse the Rebel. I mean, I'm not just saying that because it's the UK, but they, keep in mind Tim Burton's name did mean something at that time. And but unfortunately, the Corpse Bride unfortunately is cursed with the idea that there was something that unfortunately was better that came out beforehand. And so I think that's unfortunately is the albatross that hangs around the Corpse Bride's neck, unfortunately, with this. And don't get me wrong, it was a successful movie. I'm not saying that it wasn't successful. It did $40 million at the box office and took over nearly 120 million. So it was, it definitely had its fans, and and if you are a fan of Corpse Bride, then all power to you. But unfortunately, I find Corpse Bride and its presentation, I find it too dull. Don't you feel that way about this movie? It's too
I,
dull
I
and it's
can
too
I can
dark.
I can see what the direction they were trying to go with this movie. So we have two worlds. We have the living world and the dead world. The living world is playing off in that very gloomy, very grayish kind of presentation. It makes it look like that it's like supposed to be the dead world, whereas in the dead world, it's much more lively with different colors. Like it has a lot of blues, it has a lot of greens, it has a lot of personality. Whereas in the living world, it's so really deadpan, it's very dull, it's very bleak.
Yeah,
So
but unfortunately, I don't think that this whole presentation between the dead world and the living world, I don't think is done all that well. This might be a really bad example, but you know what movie did this really well?
what's that?
Coco. Do you remember?
Yeah,
Like,
but we're
there was.
talking about two completely different cultures. We're talking about the Dia de los Muertos in Mexico compared to, 18th, 19th century England. So
Yeah, I do, but I would argue that, but still, like you could still have like the dark of like the night of like the Day of the Dead and everything like that, and like you have that sort of like atmosphere of like it's dull amongst the family, but then you then open it up to the world of the dead, and you see how colorful and so how amazing and how immense that it all is, and you and I were saw Coco for the when we were doing Pixmix, and you and I were amazed when we saw it all on the big screen, weren't we?
yeah, I
And
would say that
I
even
can't
though
say,
the Yeah.
That's one thing that I think Corpse Bride needed. It needed like something like that, where like you came into the world of the dead and you were like, oh wow, look at this place. Like well, look how amazing everything looks. But if anything, it kind of looks like like a grungy rock gig, like in a basement somewhere in like in downtown New York City.
Mm.
Like it doesn't feel like you really want to get too much invested in it. Unfortunately, I didn't.
Yeah, I didn't really either. And also even though that I understood what the direction they were trying to go with trying to make the living world more dead and the dead world more living. Yeah, I mean I didn't really remember a lot of set pieces. The characters were not really that memorable. And also, this is a musical, very similar to Nightmare Before Christmas. I don't remember
And also, can you remember one song from that movie?
none.
No.
Literally none. And I saw
And
this
this is
movie
Danny
last night.
Elfman we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, now here's the thing: it's not as generic with the soundtrack he did for Epic, but you would expect Danny Elfman to craft some amazing music, and don't tell me that he didn't do that in the 2000s. I mean, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was able to give us some pretty memorable songs.
Well, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory had, you got like a song number from the 50s, a song number from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and it went like all through the eras. Like, it was so vibrant how Elfman did the music for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. But here, like, it just gets bogged down in its world. It doesn't really have a chance to kind of like be able to explore around different ways. And also on top of that, it being in the Victorian era as well. I mean, like, let's be honest, it would be kind of like it's not exactly like Danny Elfman's going to like drop a dubstep track down in like in the middle of Victorian times, is he? So like yeah, that in itself becomes a problem because the aesthetic and the gloom that is like powdered over it, it is really a problem. When it comes to Danny Elfman trying to like musically enhance this environment, which while it's how doom and gloomy it is, unfortunately, he can't do a very good job of it.
Yeah. It's trying to capture the aesthetics of 19th century England, while as for Nightmare Before Christmas, you don't know what time period it takes place in, but we can assume it's taking place in modern times, but you're able to take advantage of that and make the music very lively, but at the same time very sad and gloomy. So,
Also, I don't know about you. I mean, again, I don't know what Victorian town this era town this is taking. It's definitely not taking place in London because obviously, you don't see like any fogs of smoke, kind of like, going around. Like, you and I went to the Charles Dickens Museum
oh,
and we say exactly.
I will still remember to this very day that when we went to that Charles Dickens Museum, that we actually smelled the air that was permeating through London around the 18th century. It was awful.
Oh, exactly, yeah, but again, like, but then also you could so we saw visualizations of like what the town looked like, and like like the pea soup and how gloomy it all was, and there was funny enough, there wasn't really that, even though they did do a good job of making like the materials, if you will, like the buildings and the streets and everything like that, they didn't really add like the atmosphere. Now I could be wrong. It could be the fact that it's not in a town or like an industrial part of like wherever this town is. I guess it probably is out in the aristocrat world. But if it was down in like the London town, that smoke was everywhere.
Hmm.
Like it was the Industrial Revolution at the time.
Exactly.
So yeah, so I think they missed out a little bit on that, if you ask me. But
Yeah, and the only time in which we actually do get to see somebody coughing was the coachman. But we could argue that the reason why he was constantly coughing was because he was smoking a pipe and he was going through that, not from the air that was permeating through the town that they were living in.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, the characters themselves are just not very interesting. I mean, you have Johnny Depp playing as Victor, and he's just this typical shy kid who is forced into marriage by his parents so that they can be able to be married into high class civilization. But in reality, the family is broke, and the
Yeah,
fam
and
and
unfortunately, we're focusing back on this character that Johnny Depp is performing, which is, seeing him trying to perform film. I mean, don't get me wrong, Johnny Depp does a good job at trying to play the timid, good-natured young man, which, of course he's going to do that. He's Johnny Depp. But good grief, does it give you a feeling that, there was another character that did this also well, and also it's another Pixar film. It's Ratatouille with Alfredo
Linguini.
Linguini by Lou Romero. And it made me kind of feel like, it kind of made me long for we want to follow that character because I think that there was more sympathy, I think, for Linguini in Ratatouille than there is for Victor here in this movie. And I mean, he's a guy who's born into privilege, effectively, and his only, effectively his first world problem is that he's going to be put into this marriage with this, other woman, and I don't know why I just didn't click with our main character in all of this. And don't get me wrong, the Corpse Bride obviously is the main character in all of this, and her plight is obviously very important too. But
Yeah, I would argue that the Corpse Bride is the main character in all
well, she
this.
is. She's the title character. Funny enough, you have to keep reminding yourself that her name is Emily. In the actual credits, she's actually down as Corpse Bride. And also in the official credits, she's down as Corpse Bride too. It's only Wikipedia who makes a mention that she's actually called Emily and the movie itself.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, because nobody remembers her as Emily. They just know her as Corpse Bride, which yeah, that just goes to show you about how memorable she is as a character.
I disagree that they should have put this in the Victorian era. I think they probably should have followed the story of the fact that this is an old Jewish fable, and this could be another, movie that unfortunately, that thankfully is another movie that's Jewish people getting invested in. Unfortunately, and thankfully, it's not Adam Sandler's Eight Crazy Nights.
Oh God.
Exactly, yeah, they missed an opportunity here. I think, and to just stick it all in Victoria, England, I don't know, maybe because back in the 2000s, I mean, obviously still now, British, cool Britannia, I guess, was the thing. So maybe that was the inspiration by it. I don't know. But I just feel like this story would have been probably done better if it wasn't in Victorian England and it was somewhere else. I don't know. Maybe someone could tell me otherwise, but that's how I feel about it.
All right then. So yeah, I guess we'll just continue with the plot. So I mean, literally, when Victor and Victoria, I mean, my goodness, they had to name it after that movie where I think that she was disguising herself as a man and a woman at the same time. So yeah, I mean, I was just putting those things in my mind, but I don't know if that's
Well, it's not white chicks, that's for sure.
No, no, of course not. Not even close to it. But anyway, that's what I was thinking in my mind when I heard Victor and Victoria. But anyway, so yeah, so basically, Victor and Victoria, they literally met for the very first time, and they're going to get married the next day, and they have no chemistry whatsoever. I mean, the only time in which they've really fully had time to meet up with each other right before the Corpse Bride shows up was when they were practice their vows together. And he is just this bumbling guy who is messing up with his lines, is unable to light his candle, accidentally lights his future mother-in-law's dress on fire, and then he's just so panicky with everything. It's like, this is our main character. How am I supposed to root for him if he's just this bumbling guy who can't seem to get anything right? And
Yeah, and again, it's kind of hard to because this thing is that's sort of the depth that we go into this character with. We don't really get any more explanation than that. I mean, don't get me wrong, he does have his occasional sentimental moments with Victoria when they're left alone, but then immediately they're dragged apart by the family. Oh no, they're spending time with each other. We can't have that. It's only yeah, you expect two people who are going to be eternally bonded for the rest of their lives not to have moments with one another before they get married.
Yeah, well, I mean, the
what a
marriage
concept.
Yeah, I mean, according to them, marriage is not about love and commitment for the rest of your lives as two people as one. No, it's all about power and money. That's it. I mean, it's almost like if I'm reading a Jane Austen novel in which oh, we need to have, this person get married to this person because it'll get us out of debt and we can be able to live sophisticated lives and we don't have to worry about being called this anymore. So, my
Can I ask,
goodness.
was that in the original fable? Because I'm not familiar with
No,
the
it's
actual
not.
original story.
Remember,
That's
remember
a waste.
the reason why, I mean, he was excited to get married in the original fable. That, he and his friends went out into the woods and they were going out everyone's celebrating. So this whole arranged marriage thing has absolutely nothing to do with the original story.
Yeah, I always, and also the fact that they did that much creative license with it, and it came to basically no payoff, at least for myself personally. I just felt like I just didn't enjoy it.
I mean, there's a
Did
lot
you?
of things that don't have a lot of payoff because they're so incredibly undermined. Like, I mean, there's a lot of things that could have been like really delved deep into this. Like, okay, we have these two people who are about to get married, and they're essentially like going into this for the very first time with not knowing who one another is, and they are stuck with this commitment. Like, how are they personally feeling about this? I mean, we just see that obviously Victor is very nervous, and then Victoria is slightly nervous, but she doesn't really have too much on what she's saying about this until like maybe later on throughout the story. But then all of a sudden she's like, oh, now all of a sudden I love you, Victor, and I'm gonna try to see if I can find you because we're meant to be. And then we have Victor, who's trying to get himself out of marrying the corpse bride, even though he did it by accident. And to what? To somebody he literally just met like a few hours before he even committed to marrying the corpse bride by accident.
Yeah, like it would have made more sense if he was like originally in love with like Victoria and like to begin with. That's why the whole arranged marriage things makes no sense. Like it's you're supposed to like say, oh, you're not supposed to get married to someone that you've already met in the story between Victor and the corpse bride, but that's this freaking story between Victor and Victoria right now, and they're just getting married just for a business deal,
Yeah,
effectively. Like it's
exactly.
just like, well, what the heck are we doing here, people? Like, it's just yeah, like you just get so you want to get emotionally involved with two. When you're doing a love story, you have it where it's like, oh, here's these two or awkward people who are like and you want to get emotionally involved with one of them because you do really want to root for them being together because you see it on screen. There's so many examples of them being having sort of like shared examples. Like, you and I have seen all sorts of ships, haven't you? And
Absolutely.
yeah, and we've seen them done like really really well, and we've seen them done really really badly. And unfortunately, this is an example of them doing it really really badly in
I
this.
really wanted to get invested in this story because it would, I
But
mean,
you can't.
yeah, I can't because I mean, a lot of people actually argued that it would have been better if Victor was with the corpse bride because they actually got to spend more time with each other. Believe it or not, it's true because,
I'll
you know,
tell you
on,
what, Patricia, I'd be more invested in a ship between Tigger and Eeyore than I would be, between these two key
oh my
people.
God.
At least they would have some kind of chemistry with one another, and also they're like two opposites that would attract. You know, it's just
Anyway, uh, I mean, to be quite honest, I mean, that's the least worst thing that's ever happened to Winnie the Pooh, but I digress. Anyway, but yeah, so we go into the corpse bride being really excited that a ring is on her finger because she thinks that this is going to be the man that is destined to, fall in love with her and they can be together forever. But no, not really. It was all simply a misunderstanding. So she takes him over to the world of the dead, and everybody is so excited and they start singing a song called Remnants of the Day where they have this huge song number and
and I
they
can't remember it.
even though that Danny Elfman is the skeleton and he performs as this.
Yeah, like well, I've seen. Let's just say I've seen better skeletons perform
Yeah,
better
his name is
songs.
Jack Skellington.
I know. So that was sad to when all that was going on. So yeah, sorry, continue.
Anyway, but yeah, so there's also this other plot point where Emily gives Victor a wedding gift, and it just so happens to be his dead dog. And it's a very sweet moment, even though the dog doesn't really contribute that much compared to Zero from Nightmare Before Christmas, in which not only is he Jack's companion, but he was able to pull off a Rudolph and light the way when Sally creates the fog to prevent him from delivering the presents towards all the children at Christmas time. So yeah, I think they just needed like a little cute companion to put into the movie, and it feels really
Yeah,
forced.
here's the cute companion. Buy the toys. It says, why would you introduce such a concept if you're not going to have it? Like, it's kind of like introducing a side character, but it has no payoff, or like any like story arc. Like that's the reason why you introduce characters. You're like, they are going to do something in the side. Like you have to forgive me because it being Halloween and everyone's watching the Owl House again. I'm so-called Owl House on the mind. It's kind of like introducing Willow into the story and then not really doing anything with her. She just happens to be there for the sake of being there when they need to make up the numbers in the scene. It's like,
Hmm.
it's a wasted character,
Yeah.
effectively. But no, they don't do that. She, Willow has her own internal struggles. Willow has like, her family that, she needs to deal with. And with one dad being a bit overprotective and the other one being really cool with her, doing what she think is right. And then you have her being with her friends and she cares about her friends. Well, she did at one point care about Amity, but obviously they tell the story about understanding Willow, and I won't spoil what goes on in there. And then you see her interest in Luz because she's the first human to ever come to the Boiling Isles. And so that's, you look at, other shows or other movies and you can see examples of good side character building. And unfortunately, Corpse Bride doesn't do that very well.
Yeah, and they also introduced like other side characters in the Land of the Dead. Like you have the Maggot and you have the Black Widow, which again, I don't really remember them.
No, exactly. And on top of that, you have Christopher Lee who's playing a pastor in all of this. Now, I don't know if they did this casting ironically, because obviously Christopher Lee's been Dracula. He's obviously been Lord Summerisle from, and also he's had various other like, demon-like characters and other like, very imposing, villain characters that he's been in the past. I guess maybe they gave him this role just as an irony of like, oh, hey, he is a man of God now. Like,
Mm,
it's was that the whole idea behind that? I have no idea.
I don't know either. I
But
mean, especially
yeah,
since this what was this like his third Tim Burton movie because he was in Charlie and the
I'd
Chocolate
rather have
Factory.
seen him play a villain. Like that's what he's naturally able to do. Like,
Mm.
yeah, I don't understand why he's a pastor in this movie. That just kind of throws me a little bit. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, if he was like, one of like, the more innocent looking characters, say for example, like in Hot Fuzz, and then he turns out to be like, like one of the control freaks out of the NWA, then I would understand that. But I mean, in this, like, if you're gonna have Christopher Lee in a movie and he's not going to do anything like, as far as I'm aware, too evil, then it's kind of a bit of a waste, really.
Hmm. I guess maybe they didn't want to typecast him.
I don't know. I mean, he did it, so I guess. But again, we don't remember it, do we? Until I finally looked at the credits and found that his name was there.
Yeah, so instead we have this Lord Barkis as the main villain of the story, and it was pretty predictable that of course he ended up being the one to kill off the corpse bride so that he can get her money, and he was the one who was just luring himself into another, aristocratic house so that he can do the same thing with Victoria.
hmm It's kind of a shame, really. Like you would have thought, oh, hey, maybe he might like throw us in like in a swerve or something like that. But no. And but to be honest, like Richard E. Grant does do a good job with what he's given. So that's the one thing I'll definitely say about this. As much as we criticize, the movie itself and the characters and like that, I mean, the one thing I can definitely say is that nobody here, basically half-asses their role. So Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter, Emily Watson, Tracy Ullman, everybody do good jobs. And on top of that, Tracy Ullman and Paul Whitehouse play multiple characters in this movie. Like, so they do a very good job with what they've got. But unfortunately, what they've got isn't all that great to work with, unfortunately. So they're kind of stuck with like, this kind of gloomy mess of a movie that they have to basically kind of worm their way through.
I mean, that's essentially what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's not really much that's, I can really go on into the story. So, yeah, I
I
think
think I think one thing I mean, if we had to be fair with this movie, I mean, do you think this movie would not get as much, rap as it does is if the Nightmare Before Christmas didn't exist? Like, I mean, if we hadn't had that movie before Corpse Bride, do you think we'd be looking a bit more positively on Corpse Bride? Do you think?
probably yes, because Nightmare Before Christmas had a major legacy at that point in time. We talked about this in the Nightmare Before Christmas podcast that it was a cult classic when it came out in the 90s, but then when the 2000s hit and Disney was acknowledging that this was a movie that they were so producing, guys, Then yeah, Nightmare Before Christmas stuff
Yeah,
was everywhere.
Touchstone. What's that?
Yeah, exactly. Touchstone. What is that? So yeah, Nightmare Before Christmas became major around the 2000s. There was featured in the Kingdom Hearts games. There was a lot of merchandise of it. Marilyn Manson did the soundtrack of it. It was being re-released in theaters. They were showing Nightmare Before Christmas in the Disney theme parks. So yeah, because more people were becoming a lot more familiar with Nightmare Before Christmas, and they were hoping Corpse Bride was going to be a great follow-up to it. And then when they saw the final product, there were two camps. One who absolutely loved this movie, and then the others like us who are genuinely disappointed in it.
And by the way, to show, I don't know if this is worth mentioning or not, but do you remember HD DVDs
Yes.
when they were there? Well, one of the major movies that were released on HD DVD was Corpse Bride. And then they realized it wasn't going to sell all that well, so they released it on Blu-ray, about 10 months later,
Mm.
effectively. So yeah, so unfortunately, Corpse Bride had everything going against it, unfortunately, except for like the fact that the critics did like it and the fact that it was a successful movie. But I mean, that was back in 2005. We're now in 2023, and I barely hear anybody mention, Tim Burton's Corpse Bride not without mentioning The Nightmare Before Christmas beforehand.
Yeah, and now without mentioning Leica doing other amazing movies that follow in that horror macabre.
Well, again, if you go to Leica, I mean, everyone talks about Coraline, don't they?
Yep, they talk about
Yeah.
Coraline, they talk about Paranorman. They do not talk about Corpse Bride, even though that, like I said before, this was their first production. So I guess in a way, we kind of have to thank Corpse Bride for getting Leica started.
I guess, and I mean, but oof, I mean, it's a great thing that it was successful because if I don't know, I think people saw Corpse Bride the way they see it now compared to where they saw it, like in the middle of the 2000s. I don't know if we'd be talking about Leica as a movie as a movie producer more that much, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, Corpse Bride is definitely in that awkward period between, Nightmare Before Christmas and Coraline. And it was a movie that was completely overshadowed by Curse of the Were-Rabbit, which came out a month later and was the Oscar winner for Best Animated Film at that time. So, yeah, I mean, even though that it was one of the more successful movies that Tim Burton directed around the 2000s, it's not one of his most remembered, sadly.
Yeah, but here's the thing about this, I mean, in regards to, okay, the one positive thing I will say about Corpse Bride, and maybe it's probably not, the most positive thing to say about it. I mean, keep this in mind, the 2000s was a pretty bad decade, I think, for, animated movies. I think, wouldn't you agree? Like, we're talking about the era that basically brought us the Magic Roundabout, aka Dougal, and Alvin and the Chipmunks, the Squeakquel, and Casper's Scare School, and also the Shark Tale, and Elf Bowling the movie. It wasn't exactly a very stellar era between 2000 and 2009 for animated features. Also, it was the decade that also brought us Home on the Range as well, and that was a year before Corpse Bride.
Yeah, I mean, the 2000s is a very interesting year when it came to animated movies because 2D animated films were being box office failures. 3D animated films were the ones that were generating a lot more buzz. It was the competition between DreamWorks and Pixar. Disney was essentially in third place. Warner Brothers could not catch a break whatsoever with releasing their
Oh,
animated
good
films.
grief! And Google's also reminded me that this was the era of the animated Titanic movies,
Oh,
if you
yeah.
remember.
Yep, I
Yeah.
remember.
Oof.
Yeah. And
Thank you,
then
Italy and North Korea.
thank you. Anyway, and then also Warner Brothers just couldn't catch a break with releasing a lot of their animated films because they were all failures. Eight Crazy Nights and then the Osmosis Jones and Looney Tunes Back in Action were all just major box office bombs.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I would say that the 2000s were dominated by DreamWorks or Pixar, and everything else just came pretty secondary or pretty much in last place. Like, I mean, there was not really much of a competition at that point, unless, of course, if you want to count, like the once in a while films that just really blew people away when Studio Ghibli started coming into releasing films like Spirited Away or Howl's Moving Castle or Ponyo, or with Aardman when they released Chicken Run or Wallace and Gromit: The Curse of the Were-Rabbit. Yeah, those were probably the exceptions than the rule. But yeah, I would say it was pretty interesting year right before around the 2010s in which, animated companies, film companies basically said, wow, we need to catch up and we need to step up compared to what DreamWorks and Pixar were doing. And now we have a lot more varied studios who are able to give us amazing films. I mean, a lot of Netflix exclusive films are just as great. We talked about Nimona last time, and it was a fantastic film. And Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio won the Oscar. And Mitchell's versus the Machines is an amazing movie that we talked about last year, which was a Netflix exclusive, and also, Sony Pictures Animation, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, and the Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the Lego Movie. So yeah, it's a lot more varied today compared to what it was almost 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I would say for Corpse Bride, if you're expecting something as amazing as Nightmare Before Christmas or Coraline, prepare to be a bit disappointed. The story is very lacking. It feels like a draft and a complete story. The characters are not very memorable or interesting. The world building is kind of flat, and the music is instantly forgettable. So I would just say go watch Nightmare Before Christmas or Coraline if you're looking for that spooky time around the holidays. All right,
Cool.
well, that concludes Tim Burton month for Old Spook Lane, but we are not finished with it because we have one bonus podcast for you. So tune in next time as we're going to be talking about Scooby Doo on Zombie Island.
And that time it will be terror time once again.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.